"Mom, have you finally decided which one of us gets the trust fund?" My son Michael asked the question so casually that anyone listening might have thought he was asking me to pass the cranberry sauce. The conversation at the Thanksgiving table stopped. Forks paused in midair. My daughter Jennifer looked up so quickly that a few strands of her blonde hair fell across her face. For a moment, nobody spoke. I stared at Michael, certain I had misheard him. "What trust fund?" I asked. The silence that followed felt heavier than the turkey sitting in the middle of my dining table. Michael blinked. Jennifer blinked. Even Rachel, my daughter-in-law, suddenly became fascinated by her glass of sparkling water. I looked around the room at my children, both grown adults in their 40s, and for the first time in my 71 years, I felt like the only person who didn't know what was happening in my own family. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. After my husband Robert passed away 3 years earlier, I worked hard to keep our traditions alive. Every November, I polished the old silverware he inherited from his parents. I used the same serving dishes we had used for decades. I baked pumpkin pies from scratch and arranged fresh flowers in the center of the table. I believed traditions mattered. I believed family mattered even more. That morning, I had been up before sunrise preparing dinner. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house. Cinnamon and nutmeg drifted through the kitchen. Everything felt normal. Everything felt familiar. Yet now, sitting at that table, I realized something had changed long before that day. "What do you mean, what trust fund?" Jennifer finally said with a nervous laugh. "The trust Dad left behind." My heart skipped. Robert had handled most of our financial matters during our marriage, but I knew enough to be certain of one thing. There was no trust fund. At least, none that I knew about. "Your father never mentioned a trust fund," I replied quietly. Michael exchanged a glance with Jennifer. It lasted only a second, but it told me more than words ever could. They knew something. Or thought they did. Rachel leaned forward. "Maybe. We should talk about this later." Her voice sounded unusually careful. "No," I said. "I think we should talk about it now." Nobody answered. The warmth that had filled the room all afternoon seemed to disappear. Suddenly I noticed little things I had ignored for months. The unexpected phone calls. The sudden interest in my health. The way Michael offered to help me review paperwork I never asked him to see. The way Jennifer constantly asked whether I planned to sell the house. At the time, I thought they were concerned about me. Sitting there that evening, I began to wonder if they had been concerned about something else entirely. Dinner continued, but nobody seemed hungry anymore. Conversation drifted awkwardly from one topic to another. Football. Weather. Holiday shopping. Yet beneath every word, tension lingered. By the time the last plate was cleared away, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My children believed a fortune existed. And somehow, they believed it belonged to me. The problem was, I had no idea what they were talking about. But before the night was over, I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly why my children were fighting over money that I had never seen. After everyone left that evening, the house felt unusually quiet. The dishes were stacked neatly beside the sink, the leftovers packed into containers, and the scent of pumpkin pie still lingered faintly in the kitchen. I stood alone in the dining room, staring at the empty chairs where my children had sat only an hour earlier. For years after Robert passed away, I had grown accustomed to silence. At first, it felt unbearable. Then it became familiar. Eventually, it became something close to peace. But that night was different. The silence was not peaceful. It was full of questions. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the top drawer of the oak dresser Robert and I had purchased nearly 40 years ago. Inside were photographs, greeting cards, and small reminders of a life we had built together. I sat on the edge of the bed and slowly flipped through old pictures. There was Robert teaching Michael how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. There was Jennifer at her high school. Graduation. There we all were at Yellowstone National Park, smiling beneath a bright summer sky. Looking at those photographs, it was difficult to connect those memories to the people who had sat at my Thanksgiving table earlier that evening. Somewhere along the way, something had changed. Or perhaps something had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Around midnight, I remembered something Robert had once said during the final year of his life. We had been sitting on the back porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the horizon. He had looked unusually thoughtful. Money reveals people, he told me. Not immediately. But eventually. At the time, I assumed he was talking about a former business partner who had disappointed him. Now those words echoed in my mind differently. I rose from the bed and walked into Robert's old home office. I rarely entered that room anymore. Everything remained almost exactly as he had left it. His favorite reading chair sat beside the window. His framed college diploma still hung on the wall. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over rows of neatly organized files. Robert had always been meticulous. If there was an answer, there was a chance he had left it somewhere. I opened a cabinet and began sorting through folders. Insurance records. Tax returns. Property documents. Nothing unusual. An hour passed. Then another. Just as I considered giving up for the night, I noticed a slim envelope tucked inside a file box at the back of a shelf. It had no stamp. No mailing address. Only my name written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. My heart began to beat faster. Carefully, I sat down at his desk and turned the envelope over in my hands. The paper looked old, as though it had been waiting there for years. I hesitated before opening it. Suddenly I understood that whatever was inside might explain far more than a mysterious trust fund. It might explain why my children seemed to believe they already knew something about my future. Taking a slow breath, I slid my finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter Robert had left behind. I unfolded the letter carefully, afraid the paper might tear in my hands. Robert's handwriting was as familiar to me as my own. For a moment, it felt as though he were sitting across the desk from me again. The letter was dated almost 6 months before he passed away. My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then something has happened that finally forced you to look deeper. I only hope it happened later rather than sooner. I smiled sadly. Even in a letter written years ago, he sounded exactly like himself. Practical. Thoughtful. Always planning 3 steps ahead. I continued reading. There are things I chose not to explain while I was alive. Not because I did not trust you, but because I wanted you protected from decisions that should never have become your burden. If our children begin asking questions about money, property, trusts, or inheritances, pay close attention. Do not focus on what they say. Focus on why they are saying it. I lowered the paper and stared at the desk. A chill ran through me. Robert could not have predicted that Thanksgiving conversation. Yet somehow it felt as though he had. I continued reading. Wealth changes people slowly. It rarely happens all at once. The first sign is not greed. The first sign is curiosity. Then comes entitlement. By the time someone begins discussing what belongs to them, they have already convinced themselves it is theirs. My stomach tightened. Suddenly dozens of memories from the past year began resurfacing. Michael insisting on helping me organize my financial records. Jennifer casually asking whether I planned to downsize and move into a smaller home. Rachel offering to accompany me to meetings I never asked her to attend. At the time, every gesture seemed caring. Looking back, they felt different. The letter continued. If you have reached this point, there is another document you must find. It is not in the house. It is with Daniel Whitmore. You remember him as my attorney. Tell him I said the clock has started. He will understand. My eyes widened. Daniel Whitmore. Robert's attorney had handled our estate planning for decades. I had not spoken to him in almost a year. The final paragraph was short. Eleanor, if our children are acting differently, there is a reason. Be patient. Learn the truth before you make judgments. And remember something important. Not everyone who appears loyal is honest. And not everyone who disappoints you is beyond redemption. I folded the letter slowly and sat in silence. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning to appear beyond the window. I had spent the entire night searching for answers and somehow ended up with even more questions. Yet one thing was now certain. Robert had expected this. Years ago, he had seen something coming that I never noticed. As the sun rose over the neighborhood, I reached for my telephone. Daniel Whitmore's office opened at 8 o'clock. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt determination. Whatever secret my family had been circling around, I was finally going to uncover it. Daniel Whitmore answered my call personally. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but still calm and precise. When I told him about Robert's letter, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I wondered if this day would ever come, he finally said. Those words stayed with me during the entire drive to his office. Daniel's building stood in the same place it had for decades, a red brick structure overlooking the town square. Robert and I had visited many times over the years, usually to sign paperwork or discuss estate planning. Walking through those familiar doors without him felt strange. Daniel greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. A thick folder rested on the table between us. I recognized Robert's name printed neatly across the front. Before we begin, Daniel said, folding his hands, I need to ask you something. Have your children started behaving differently in the past year or two? The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully. Then I began listing the changes. Michael calling every week after years of occasional contact. Jennifer suddenly interested in my doctor appointments. Rachel offering advice about finances I had never requested. As I spoke, Daniel simply nodded. None of this seemed to surprise him. When I finished, he opened the folder. Robert created a long-term estate structure almost 12 years ago, he explained. He revised it several times before his passing. Most of the details were intentionally kept confidential. I stared at him. Confidential from whom? Daniel met my eyes. From nearly everyone. My heart began to race. He removed several documents and placed them on the table. I recognized Robert's signature immediately. There were pages of legal language, financial records, and trust agreements. Much of it was unfamiliar to me. Yet one detail stood out immediately. The numbers were far larger than I expected. Much larger. Robert never told me about any of this, I whispered. Daniel nodded. That was intentional. He slid another document toward me. Your husband believed that wealth should serve people, not control them. He was concerned about what might happen if certain family members became focused on future inheritances instead of present relationships. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Are you telling me my children knew about this? Daniel chose his words carefully. I am telling you that information appears to have circulated over the years. Not all of it was accurate. Suddenly Thanksgiving dinner made more sense. The strange looks. The awkward silence. The assumption that I controlled some enormous fortune. For years, they had apparently been building expectations around money I knew nothing about. Then who actually controls it? I asked. Daniel closed the folder slowly. That is the question your husband wanted answered at the proper time. He reached into the folder and removed one final sealed envelope. Unlike Robert's letter, this one looked newer. My name was written across the front. Beneath it were 6 words in Robert's handwriting that made my pulse quicken. Open only after meeting Daniel Whitmore. As I stared at the envelope, I realized I was standing at the edge of a truth far larger than anything I had imagined. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter and a folded sheet of paper attached behind it. Robert's handwriting immediately caught my eye. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then Daniel has shown you enough for you to understand that appearances can be deceiving. Please read every word before making any decisions. I took a slow breath and continued. Over the years, I watched our children grow into successful adults. I was proud of them. But I also noticed something troubling. Whenever conversations turned to money, inheritances, or property, their attitudes changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for me to pay attention. I paused and stared at the page. Memories surfaced immediately. Michael asking detailed questions about investment accounts during family dinners. Jennifer wondering aloud how much homes in our neighborhood were worth. Small comments I had dismissed at the time. The letter continued. I did not build safeguards because I expected failure. I built safeguards because I hoped our children would prove me wrong. My chest tightened. Robert had spent years planning something I never knew existed. Then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. The trust everyone believes exists does exist. However, it has never been controlled by you. It has never been controlled by our children. In fact, it was designed specifically so that none of you could access it directly. I reread the sentence twice. Then a third time. Across the table, Daniel remained silent. He seemed content to let me absorb the information at my own pace. I turned to the attached document. At the top was the name of a trust one had never heard before. Below it was a list of conditions, legal provisions, and dates stretching back more than a decade. The structure was complicated, but one fact became clear almost immediately. Michael and Jennifer had spent years assuming a fortune was waiting for them. Yet neither of them actually understood how it worked. Neither did I. Who has authority over this? I finally asked. Daniel pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. I followed his finger. There, listed in precise legal language, was the answer. An independent trustee. Not a family member. Not a friend. A professional fiduciary company located nearly 1,000 miles away. I looked up in disbelief. They have been fighting over money that none of us controls. Daniel nodded. As of today, yes. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly Thanksgiving dinner looked completely different. The tension. The assumptions. The certainty in their voices. They had been competing for something they did not actually possess. Yet one question still remained. Then why did Robert leave all this to me now? Daniel gave a small smile. Because there is one final provision. He opened another section of the file. And that provision becomes active on your 72nd birthday. My heart skipped. My birthday was less than 4 months away. Daniel slid the document toward me. As I began reading the next page, I realized Robert's final test had not been designed for our children alone. It had been designed for me as well. For the rest of the drive home, I could not stop thinking about Robert's final provision. For months. That was all that remained before my 72nd birthday. For months before a decision that apparently carried enormous consequences. Yet Robert had not simply handed me authority. He had attached conditions. Requirements. Expectations. When I arrived home, I placed the documents on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet again. Outside, a cold wind rattled the bare branches in the backyard. I sat there for nearly an hour reading every page Daniel had given me. The language was formal and complicated, but the purpose gradually became clear. Robert had designed the trust as a test. Not a test of intelligence. Not a test of financial knowledge. A test of character. On my 72nd birthday, I would gain the authority to recommend how the trust would ultimately benefit the family. The trustee would review my recommendation and implement it if the conditions had been satisfied. At first glance, it sounded simple. Then I reached the pages describing those conditions. My recommendation could not be based on promises. It could not be based on family pressure. It could not be influenced by requests, demands, or expectations. Instead, I was instructed to evaluate the behavior of every potential beneficiary over time. Robert wanted actions, not words. Suddenly I understood why he had hidden everything. If the family knew the truth, every interaction would become a performance. Every kind gesture would be suspect. Every phone call could have a motive attached to it. The following week, I decided to tell no one about my meeting with Daniel. Life continued as usual on the surface. Michael called on Tuesday evening. He spent 20 minutes asking about my health before carefully steering the conversation toward long-term planning. Jennifer invited me to lunch that Friday. During dessert, she casually mentioned how difficult college expenses might become for her youngest son. Neither conversation sounded unusual by itself. Yet now I heard every word differently. I began paying attention. Really paying attention. Over the next several weeks, patterns emerged. Michael frequently talked about responsibility and sacrifice. Jennifer often discussed fairness and family obligations. Rachel seemed especially interested in whether I had recently updated any legal documents. None of them knew that I already possessed answers they were desperately searching for. One evening, as Christmas approached, Michael and Jennifer arrived at my house within 30 minutes of each other. Neither knew the other had called ahead. The coincidence felt too perfect. We sat in the living room drinking hot chocolate while snow drifted outside the windows. At first, the conversation was pleasant. Then a subtle disagreement appeared. Michael mentioned estate taxes. Jennifer immediately corrected him. Michael challenged her opinion. Jennifer challenged his. Within minutes, they were debating financial matters neither of them actually understood. I sat quietly and listened. Neither seemed interested in the facts. They were interested in winning. As their voices grew sharper, I remembered something from Robert's letter. The first sign is not greed. The first sign is curiosity. Then comes entitlement. Watching my children argue beside the Christmas tree, I realized something painful. Robert had not been preparing for a future problem. He had recognized 1 year ago. And with every passing week, I was beginning to see exactly what he saw. January arrived with grey skies and bitter winds. My 72nd birthday was now less than 2 months away, and the closer it came, the more obvious the changes in my family became. Michael started visiting every Saturday morning. He brought coffee from my favorite cafe and offered to help with small projects around the house. On the surface, it seemed thoughtful. Yet there was always a moment when the conversation drifted toward finances. Sometimes he asked whether I had spoken with any attorneys recently. Other times he wondered whether I had considered creating a family legacy plan. Jennifer approached things differently. She preferred emotion over strategy. She called almost every evening. She reminisced about childhood vacations. She talked about family traditions. She often reminded me how important it was to keep resources within the family. The words sounded innocent enough, but after everything I had learned, I could hear the calculation hiding beneath them. Then there was Rachel. Of the three, she worried me most. Unlike Michael and Jennifer, she rarely spoke directly about money. Instead, she asked questions. Small questions. Careful questions. Questions that seemed harmless until I noticed how frequently they appeared. Had I updated my will? Had I reviewed my investment accounts? Did I still keep important documents at home? Every question felt like a fishing line cast into dark water. One afternoon, I received an unexpected invitation from Jennifer. She wanted to take me shopping. We spent several hours walking through a large indoor mall nearly 30 miles from town. For a while, everything felt normal. We laughed. We shared lunch. We talked about her children. Then, while sitting in the food court, she suddenly grew serious. "Mom," she said softly, "have you ever worried that some people might try to take advantage of you as you get older?" The question caught my attention immediately. "What do you mean?" I asked. Jennifer hesitated. I just think you should be careful about who influences your decisions. The irony was almost painful. Here she was warning me about influence while quietly trying to shape my thinking herself. I smiled and changed the subject. That evening, I wrote detailed notes in a journal I had started. After meeting Daniel, every conversation, every unusual question, every contradiction, Robert had asked me to observe actions rather than words. So that was exactly what I was doing. By February, the tension between Michael and Jennifer was becoming impossible to ignore. They interrupted each other during family gatherings. They challenged each other's opinions. They competed for my attention in ways they never had before. One Sunday afternoon, I watched them argue over something as trivial as who should help me prepare my tax documents. Neither had shown any interest in that responsibility for years. Now both insisted they were the best person for the job. As their disagreement grew more heated, I sat quietly in my chair and looked at the family photographs displayed across the mantel. The contrast was heartbreaking. The smiling children in those pictures had once cared only about being together. The adult standing in my living room seemed focused on something entirely different. For the first time, I began to understand the true purpose behind Robert's plan. He had not created a test to discover who deserved money. He had created a test to reveal who they had become. My 72nd birthday arrived on a cold March morning. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the maple tree outside my kitchen window was beginning to show the first signs of spring. I spent the early hours alone, drinking coffee and thinking about Robert. Nearly every major decision in my adult life had involved him in some way. This one would not. At 10 o'clock, I drove to Daniel Whitmore's office for the meeting Robert had arranged years before. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something unusual. Michael was already there. So was Jennifer. Rachel sat beside him. The moment they saw me enter the conference room, all conversation stopped. No one seemed surprised to see the others. That told me more than they probably intended. Daniel greeted everyone politely and invited us to sit. The atmosphere felt tense, almost formal. A thick folder rested on the center of the table. I recognized it immediately. It was the same file I had been studying for months. Michael cleared his throat. Jennifer folded her arms. Rachel remained silent but watched everything carefully. Daniel opened the meeting with a brief statement. Today marks the activation date of the final provision established by Robert Hayes. The room became perfectly still. I noticed Michael sitting straighter in his chair. Jennifer's eyes never left the folder. Daniel continued. Before any recommendation can be submitted, certain observations and evaluations must be reviewed. Michael frowned. Evaluations? Daniel nodded. Your father established a process. He believed character mattered more than expectations. I saw confusion flash across both my children's faces. Neither had expected that answer. For nearly an hour, Daniel reviewed documents, timelines, and trust provisions. The more he explained, the more uncomfortable the room became. Every assumption Michael and Jennifer had made over the years began to unravel. The trust was real. The assets were real. Yet the control they believed existed had never belonged to me. It had never belonged to them. Most importantly, no inheritance had ever been guaranteed. At one point Jennifer interrupted. Then what was all of this for? Daniel looked toward me before answering. Robert wanted actions to reveal priorities. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over a room when people begin recognizing truths they have spent years avoiding. As the meeting continued, I found myself studying my children rather than the documents. Michael looked frustrated. Jennifer looked shocked. Neither seemed angry. They seemed disappointed. Not because money had been lost, but because certainty had vanished. For years they had built expectations around something they never truly understood. Now those expectations were collapsing in front of them. Finally Daniel closed the folder. "There is one final stage remaining," he said. "And that stage belongs entirely to Eleanor." Every head turned toward me. For the first time all morning, no one spoke. I looked at my children and realized that whatever happened next would reveal far more than any legal document ever could. I looked at my children for a long moment before speaking. Michael avoided my eyes. Jennifer sat perfectly still. Rachel remained quiet, waiting. For months, I had observed them. I had listened carefully. I had watched what happened when they believed a fortune was within reach. Now it was finally time to answer the question Robert had left behind. "I spent years thinking this was about money," I said softly. "But it was never about money." Nobody interrupted. Even Daniel remained silent. "Your father understood something before I did. He understood that wealth can reveal character. Not because people become different, but because they stop hiding who they already are." Michael shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer lowered her gaze. I opened a small notebook and placed it on the table. It was the journal I had kept during the previous months. Every conversation. Every visit. Every request. Every contradiction. I wrote everything down, I said. Not because I wanted evidence. Because I wanted clarity. The room felt smaller somehow. The silence grew heavier. "Michael, you spoke often about responsibility. But most of our conversations eventually returned to money." I turned toward Jennifer. "You spoke about family and loyalty. Yet many of your concerns seemed tied to what the future might provide rather than what the present required." Neither argued. Neither denied it. For the first time, there were no explanations. No carefully chosen words. Just truth. I took a slow breath. "The most important thing I learned is that neither of you ever asked what I wanted." That sentence landed harder than anything else I had said. I could see it in their faces. Over the past few years, countless questions had been asked. About assets. About plans. About property. Yet very few questions had been about me. Daniel opened the final document. "Mrs. Hayes has submitted her recommendation," he announced. Michael looked up immediately. Jennifer did the same. Their expressions carried equal parts hope and fear. Daniel continued. "The trust will remain intact. The principal assets will not be distributed directly to individual beneficiaries." Shock crossed both of their faces. Then Daniel read the remainder of my recommendation. A significant portion would fund college scholarships for future generations of the family. Another portion would support local education programs in memory of Robert. The remaining assets would remain protected within the trust, providing assistance only when genuine need arose and only under the conditions Robert had established. No lump sum inheritance. No immediate payout. No winner. Complete silence filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. Michael laughed softly. Not out of anger. Out of disbelief. Jennifer shook her head and smiled sadly. "Dad really thought this through, did he not?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "He did." For the first time all morning, the tension began to fade. The competition was over because there was nothing left to compete for. As we stood to leave, I glanced at the photograph Daniel kept on his bookshelf. It was an old picture of Robert taken years ago. He looked exactly as I remembered him. Calm. Thoughtful. Patient. Walking out of that office, I finally understood the answer to the question that had haunted our family for years. The money was never the real inheritance. The lesson was,